This month's podcast features Michael Mino, who has over 25 years of experience working at all levels of education with a strong track record of innovation. As a high school teacher, he transformed traditional 20th century classes into state-of-the-art 21st century skills programs. As a technology and curriculum specialist, he was the founder of numerous innovative high school programs. He is the founder of Development Services, which provides a variety of innovative education development services to schools and classrooms. In this podcast, you'll hear Mike speak about how to keep students engaged in learning.
What they found was students were most engaged and learned the most when the work they were doing was most like work and most like play.
How artificial intelligence should be used as a collaborative process.
So I can use ChatGPT to generate an essay on any topic imaginable. Or I can collaborate with it. Sal Khan did a great demonstration last week at a TED Talk where he had the AI write a line of an essay, and then the student generate the line, and then AI write another line, and then the student generate another line. That's, a really good example of a writing collaboration.
And how we are now living in the science fiction world created decades ago.
And we are going to be able to talk to the computer just like that and say, computer, compare this to that. So compare this code to that code. I don't care what it's for, but it's the comparison of code, a comparison of a sentence. Or we're living science fiction right now.
This podcast was created by JFY Networks, a Boston-based nonprofit provider of online learning resources, training, and support. JFY's individualized self-paced curriculum helps raise individual and school performance by recovering learning loss and reaching and maintaining grade-level skills. For JFY Networks, I'm Greg Cunningham. Michael Mino has always been at the forefront of using technology to improve education, working to advance 21st century learning for public and private schools and organizations in the United States, Mexico, and Africa. In his recent conversation with JFY's executive director, Gary Kaplan, Mike spoke about the earth-shattering changes artificial intelligence will bring to the classroom.
Well, good morning, Mike. Nice to see you on this bright, sunny day. And I'm looking forward to this discussion today. We've talked quite a bit over the past few years about this, the whole development of artificial intelligence anyway, but things have picked up so much speed in the past, of course, since November, since ChatGPT. It's timely for us to get into it again and see where is artificial intelligence now in the education field as educators. What should we be looking for, and what should we be doing?
Yeah. Hi, Gary. Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning. I've got a lot of thoughts about this, and I really feel kind of in some ways privileged to be able to talk about this from a perspective of actually being in the classroom with students right now. And I was kind of thinking back to my first experience with computers in the classroom, which goes back to 1987. We had this device called computer eyes. And it was literally a box that you set on the counter next to the computer, plugged it into the computer, and then we had to stand in front of it for 5 minutes as it reproduced line by line a photograph of whatever was in front of it. And I'm, reflecting on that, thinking, wow, now we can produce photographs from text in seconds.
1987, huh? And
I actually found a document for it online. There's a document for it. It's called Computer Eyes.
Computer Eyes. What was the computer?
That was our first lab. Our first lab at the high school I was teaching at in the Berkshires was Mac Plus. It was a collection of Macs, old, 8-inch screen Macs. And a laser printer is our first digital, not our first publishing lab that we had in high school, and definitely the first computer vision, as they called it in those days, technology we had in that. And at the same time, we also had a dark room with the chemicals needed to produce photographs from film.
That's right. That was before digital photography, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I think, I bring that up because I think it's a lesson, and it's one of those things we can learn, Steve Jobs said you can't predict the future by looking ahead, but you can connect the dots by looking back. And I think that's what we can do with this. We can connect some dots here, right? We can connect some dots by looking back at what are these other technologies that we've survived in education, and some have prospered, some have not. But if you think of the major developments, like first personal computers, as back in the 80s, the internet in the 90s, mobile phones, other online technologies, social media in the 2000s, and now AI in the 2020s.
Mike, how different is AI from all of these things that have gone before? How different is it?
Some of the one of the things I like about it, and one of the things we're embracing, is the ability to do things that would have taken many years. And it's something I've always thought about with technology, is how students are able to master a technology before their teachers, right? Because many times they have more time to spend with it. Teacher doesn't have as much time with it. And it's actually this idea of generational leap, where students are leaping the abilities of their elders with certain technologies in society. And AI is sort of accelerating that, because now, for instance, I've been working with a high school group teaching with a course with video game design. And video game design is a pretty complex, collaborative, challenging activity. If you're really talking about video game design, like forming a team, coming up with a concept, then building it out, coding, music, characters. There's so many elements to it. And we just embraced AI as part of that experience, where students had some ideas, they plugged it into ChatGPT, and it immediately developed a storyline. Had some ideas around characters, plugged that in, and immediately developed character details. So I think, this idea that it lowers the barrier. It lowers the bar for engaging in some very, very creative activities.
Well, that's a good little window to get into. So it develops the storyline, and it develops the character profile, character detail. All right, so I've got an idea for a particular game, but it could also be a play, it could be a movie, it could be whatever. It's a dramatic structure. So I plug some ideas in, and ChatGPT develops the storyline, and then it develops my characters. Doesn't that kind of take over the basic creative function?
Well, once you start doing that, you'll find, like, I think Alan Alda gave this example a couple weeks ago on his podcast, where he tried to get it to develop a new episode of MASH. And it wasn't very good. I mean, it was an episode of MASH that it was viable as an episode, but it really didn't have that kind of, spark that the original MASH had. And so I think that's the role of the humans in this process, where the students had ideas around a video game, and you have to know something about video games, which many students do because they play them so much, but they didn't know how to make the game. All right. So whether it's a side scroller or a fantasy or a role play, right? There are different versions, different types of games. And these guys just, started putting in their description of a type of game. So it's really, without the human interaction, you can't produce anything, right? It's just sitting there, dormant. But once you start interacting with it, which brings up, a whole new level of skill for students. And I think we've been talking about kind of preparing students for the future, contributing members of our society, of a technological society. I think this brings that responsibility to the forefront. Students need to know how to write differently. So writing for an AI is different than writing a comparative essay. So we're talking more about expository writing, where they're giving instructions, they're giving descriptions, details.
How different is that?
Yeah, it depends on the typical English ELA assignment. But in terms of the type of writing, it's comparable to, I've done a project for a number of years with students where they actually develop ideas around new technologies and new applications of technology. And we always had them produce a white paper. So a white paper is a traditional technical paper that describes the technology, identifies the problem, identifies the solution, talks about the applications of the solution. That is the kind of writing that I think is going to become more important going in, as we see a proliferation of AI across society. It's that type of writing. And so you have a perfect opportunity to develop that using platforms like ChatGPT.
Let's think about a different type of writing. I'm not sure what to call it. Social, historical, critical, or some cluster of terms like that. How would you know whether what ChatGPT produced was accurate or not? Or issues where there's a lot of different points of view, and it makes some difference which side of the question you come down on.
Yeah, well, I think that's no different than validating sources of an internet search. I mean, we've been trying to get students and understanding how to citate sources and then validating those sources, right? Using a variety of sources. I think you bring up a good point about, let's say, that assignment of being able to describe the relationship between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King takes on a different structure. It's still a valid assignment, but the structure is different, right? And so you might have ChatGPT generate that first draft, and then the role of the student is to critique it and validate the source of that information. Now, that's already happening. So if we're talking about just ChatGPT, but Microsoft has built in ChatGPT into the Bing search engine. So when you do a search, or when you query ChatGPT in Bing, because they're using ChatGPT, you get a collection of internet links as well. So that issue, student can go to ChatGPT as the platform itself, and they won't get the internet searches, but they could go to Bing, and many students are using, Microsoft products in schools, or if they're using Google, that's going to be the same thing as the Bard AI in the Google search engine. So you do the query to the AI, and then you get a collection of internet sources for information as well.
So you can find internet sources on any side of any issue. So how do you know where your ChatGPT is going for its sources? It can give you 10,000 sources that say one thing, but there's another 10,000 sources that say the opposite. How do you know?
Right. Well, this is the whole question when you hear people talking about, like, quote, the alignment problem, that we have to align it with human values. Whose values are we talking about?
Well, exactly.
Because obviously we can't even agree on the values state by state. Do we have the values in one state that says it's not right for an 18-year-old to own a gun, and another state it is? So, I think that's another part of the changing role and nature of education in the future. We do have to be able to teach students how to think critically, evaluate the impact of these technologies, evaluate how they use it according to someone's values.
How do we deal with the question of values?
Yeah, I think rather than telling students this is a right set of values or that's a wrong set of values, although some people would want to do that, I think we have to, that's is where, again, the structure and the nature of what students do in school is going to have to change, and incorporating the exploration or identification of values for students, whether it's from their family's perspective or their faith perspective, that, and this is where project-based learning comes in, where it's a more complex way of learning, but it can incorporate different elements like that. I mean, I've been doing some work in some faith-based schools, and one of the schools I worked with had a capstone project. And one of the components of that capstone project was they had to identify a concept, fundamental value, or a verse that would support their pursuit of this project. Why were they pursuing this project? So I think we can do that without endorsing any one set of values, but opening the door to the students' exploration of that from their family perspective, if need be, or their faith perspective.
Well, I suppose there's something to be said for the idea of, okay, student, you have this idea. Let's go find some backup for it, and then the student now has the capability of finding 10,000 sources that supports his or her idea. And I suppose you could also say, all right, that's great. You've created a whole encyclopedia supporting your idea. Now let's take a different idea or the opposite idea. Now I want you to sit down and give me 10,000 sources on the other side of it. I suppose that could be a good exercise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a compare and contrast, right?
Yeah,
and contrast a perspective. And again, this is kind of like, again, the changing nature of what the type of assignments that teachers are going to have to be thinking about in the future. And I know a teacher the other day was telling me, well, we're looking at more short form in the classroom type response to questions, as opposed to just being online and being able to generate a response to a prompt by a teacher.
What does short form mean?
A couple of paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs in class. Write it in class.
To be done right there while I'm looking at over your shoulder to make sure you're not cribbing it.
Exactly. And I'm sure that's one way to approach it. I mean, but personally, I think most of what I'm reading about AI is that it's going to become prevalent in 80% of the fields out in the world today. And employment fields, works, jobs, 80%, like 20% maybe. I think like plumbers won't be using AI to fix the pipes, but they might be using it to help manage their business. Right. But in terms of like the actual doing the physical work, builders, plumbers, iron workers, steel workers, metal workers, but they're going to use AI probably in some component of that work, but not to actually do the work. So to say that we don't want students to use AI for any, is, I think, doing them an injustice. We need to start to learn how to use it in the context of the work we do. We need to learn how to use it in the context of the work they do. So this idea that you're going to ban it, number one, is, it's
good luck.
A dream, because it's already everywhere.
Good luck with that.
Even if you ban access on your network, the students will access it through their phone or their home. And your 2 major platforms, Google and Microsoft, the 2 major platforms that all schools are using, are integrating it into all of their tools. So we need to start learning how to use it, not how to ban it. And the use cases are very different. There's a variety of use cases. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what we're doing, which I've actually been doing in classrooms with students. So one is digital media. So the subject of digital media is a really popular subject for high school students in particular. Learning how to use different platforms is a great platform. The Adobe Creative Cloud, it's incredible tools. There's the tools that professionals use to produce movies, photos, images, 3D models, you name it. It's anything digital in media can be produced with the Adobe Cloud. And they're building an application, it's already available, called Firefly. And it's a generative AI, and it's built on their own images. So it wasn't built using images from the internet. It was built using Adobe's own library of images. So it doesn't infringe on anyone's copyright, which is one of the arguments about generative images. And secondly, you generate an image, and then you're given a whole suite of tools to modify that image. And this is what I like, about it. And I've seen how the kids react to it too. It's like, okay, well, I used this prompt, it produced this image. One image was, cats floating in space in astronaut suits. Well, it's not quite what I like about it, or I like this part of it, I don't like that part of it. Well, this palette of tools will let you change all that. It lets you change every element of the image that's been generated. So we have something that was originally generated by AI, now modified by students and their creative thinking. So that's one example. Another
so
example.
You can say, let me just. So you can say, I want cats floating in space in astronaut suits, and it'll give you that image.
Yep.
And then you manipulate it from there on to get it the way you want it. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. You can change the colors. You can change the style. You can change the tone. I mean, there are all these elements of images. Saturation, brightness, contrast. You can do all that. Color.
So it gives you the first. It gives you the first sketch of your idea.
Yes, gives you the first draft.
The cartoon.
So it's a drafting tool. The other day we had somebody came in and asked us if we could produce a logo. And so I said, well, let's use that as an exercise in how to use AI. How would we go about using AI to produce a logo? And so we went into a tool called Microsoft Designer. It's a brand new platform. And it's designer.microsoft.com. And it allows you, it's a lot simpler than the Creative Suite, but it's an image generator with a palette of tools to modify images. And so I walked the students through the process. Okay, well, let's think of some ideas. The first idea that came up was because it had something to do with thinking, everyone thinking. I said, well, the most famous image of thinking is The Thinker by Rodin. So we typed that in, and we typed in silhouette, colorful, and students, and a couple of keywords. And we had a very effective first draft of an image of essentially was a silhouette of a student in the, with a hand under the chin, the head down, thinking in a classroom surrounded by colorful silhouettes of other students. And,
okay, question. Wait, a question. If you had not come up with that idea of the Rodin, how would you have started? If you didn't know that, how would you have started?
Well, this is the role of the teacher. I'm the one who prompted the students. I said, well, tell me if somebody says thinker, what comes to mind? And immediately a number of students said, oh, the thinker, the statue of the thinker. Right. So what
if you had started instead with brain?
Right. Actually, somebody did do that. Yes.
And where did that go?
That direction.
Where did that go?
It produced completely different results. Yeah, completely different results. And some students went down the sci-fi cyberpunk, road and created this very futuristic kind of like almost, the way you've seen like robot heads, robots with computer, circuitry in the head. It produced that. So we got a lot of different results, but it was the same assignment. And all, using a designer is a very simple platform. It really is easy to use. And it's based on the DALL-E, the ChatGPT or the OpenAI DALL-E image generator, because Microsoft is, invested now in OpenAI as a company, and they're using their tools.
Yeah.
So that's one example. Another example was in the makerspace, where we have a makerspace with a lot of different tools in there, 3D printers, laser. We're doing robotics. We're doing electronics. A lot of work with Arduino. It's a platform for learning electronics and programming. And we built a robot that was just a simple robot with 2 motors and a sensor. And we didn't have a code that was working. So in ChatGPT, we put in the prompt and said, create a code for an obstacle avoiding robot, which this was because it has an obstacle avoidance sensor that has 2 motors and can randomly turn when encountering an obstacle. And within seconds, it generated a viable code, but it didn't only generate the code, it actually then provided detailed explanation of the code. And one of the things that most impressed me about it was it gave us the sensor number. Even though we didn't give it the sensor number, it said this code is for sensor using obstacle avoidance sensor number. I forget the number was, but it was a Arduino sensor, and it was exactly the right sensor we were using. And then it went on to explain how it generated the code, what the code said. So for instance, when it encounters an obstacle, it will randomly turn right or left, and it will do so, within a number of seconds. I mean, it was very, very impressive, and it worked. Code worked. So the bar for using that code now, it's not necessary to actually learn all of the elements of the code, but you can learn the coding while using the code, in a sense. Instead of learning to code first so you can generate the code, you can generate the code now and then learn about the code. And there's a lot of discussion right now about the future of computer science and coding because of what these coding AI platforms can do. Do we still need to teach coding? We've been trying to, it's trying to be a national movement to teach computer science and coding for the last 10 years. It's mediocre success at best.
So now all of a sudden, is it even necessary? So after 10 years,
well, some are even questioning the value of a computer science department. I mean, we're talking about
of course, yeah.
So again, it's about collaborating with the AI. I think that's what we have to get to, and we're going to have to do that in ways that I think favor things like project-based learning and favor things like art programs and music programs and creative expression. I mean, these are all areas that students in schools embrace already, some more than others, but I think they are going to become more important, especially this idea around project-based learning and this thing called, I don't know if you've ever heard the term personal interest project or a passion project. Yes, where the student identifies something they want to learn, make, or do or solve. And it's a very broad way of approaching project-based learning based on student interest. So I think those are the type of things that are kind of like right now they're secondary in most schools, or they're an add-on, or they're like if the student has time, you might get to a project. I think those kind of things are going to become more prevalent as AI becomes more prevalent.
High Tech High in San Diego, is that the model?
Yeah, or the other one even closer to home is the Big Picture School in Rhode Island, started by Dennis Littke. Big Picture Schools, which basically students identify one problem or one area of study for the whole year, and then the education program is built around that for the whole year. Now that's a complete restructuring of high
Yeah,
school experience. Okay, that's
yeah,
the Big Picture School, which the Gates Foundation funded. It's been expanded around the country. It's a complete restructuring. High Tech High is not that extensive, although it is again focused on projects exclusively on project-based learning. To me, these are going to be the primary ways of learning, and it also prepares students for what's called, for the future of work, right? Working in teams, working with AI, working collaboratively. And a few years ago, it's quite a few years ago now. I don't know if you know Project Zero at Harvard with Howard Gardner and this another gentleman named Csikszentmihalyi. Csikszentmihalyi created the concept of flow, right? The idea that you get into something and you're totally consumed, you lose track of time. You're totally focused and consumed by it. But he also wrote another book called Becoming Adults. And it was a research study on high school students and when and how they were engaged in school. And it was rather simple because back then they didn't have the computer technology you have now, but using a watch and a timer, students would respond to a questionnaire every so often throughout the day. And what they found was students were most engaged and learn the most when the work they were doing was most like work and most like play. So when most like work, like something that was real and meaningful, but also most like play, playful, right? Interesting, enjoyable, and playful. And that study stuck with me for years because it really laid the foundation of this idea that you can engage students in higher level thinking, higher level work, and effectively. And I think it's the challenge of doing that with the old tools was a lot harder than we're going to be facing in the future with some of these new tools. So designing a logo, for instance, that's something that real people actually do. Okay, that's an activity done by graphic designers. Okay, programming a robot, that's an activity done by
real
robot
people.
technicians. Okay. Yeah, so I think that's the idea, is to engage students in things in school that are most like work and most like play, because robots are a lot of play. They're very playful.
How are you going to square that with grade level standards? Grade K through 12. You got to do algebra in this grade, geometry in this grade, algebra 2 in this grade. How are you going to square project-based things or flow? How are you going to square that with
Well, I think,
the established, the structure of you got to do this year, and then there's a test, and then you got to do this next year, and then there's a test.
yeah. So I think, there's still, of course, you're still going to have that foundation knowledge that you need for all of these different subject areas. And it turns out in some cases that AI might be more effective in teaching that to students, and not only more effective, but do it with a lot less time, in a lot less time. And
Mhm.
so if you embrace that method of teaching alongside the project-based method of teaching, then because you're being more effective and how students are learning core competencies, let's call them common core competencies, or right, of an ELA in mathematics,
And we have to
then it
say
gives you more time.
mass state standards. We have to say state standards here. We can't
Yes,
say Common Core.
yeah, state
Yeah,
standards.
yeah,
And also, but if you look at like the national, the NGSS, the national science standards,
yeah.
those standards embrace project-based learning. They embrace the practice of science, not just the study of science, but the practice of science. And that will, that takes time. That takes time, and so being more efficient and more effective in the core competencies gives you more time then to focus on project-based learning and doing, whether it's science, whether it's technology, whether it's music or art, whatever the students' interests are.
For the past quite a few years, actually, the emphasis on STEM has resulted in a de-emphasis on the arts. Is that the way you see it? That AI is going to have the surprising result of re-emphasizing creativity? Is that the way you see this moving?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, anybody who thought de-emphasizing the arts in the advancement of STEM was doing that, was advocating that from a point of ignorance. Because if you read the great scientists, Einstein said it himself, like creativity is the essence of science. right? You can't be creative you can't be a scientist without being creative. Or, I mean, Daniel Pink, his book about, everybody in the future will have a master's of art, a master's degree in art is the new master's of business administration. Or, there's just so many examples of where science and art are, complementary skills, and thinking creatively is essential in those areas. And that's the way I've always approached it. So when we did this technology project where students are, quote, applying a new technology to solve a problem, there's a design element, there's a design element to that. They're designing a logo, they're designing a company name, they're designing a solution to a problem. So I think it should have been there all along. If it hasn't been, it's because of ignorance. And I think it will, I think it's going to increase interest and advocacy for the arts and education. Because again, it's also about the complementary role of working, not replacing teachers, but working with teachers, and how teachers are going to be using these new platforms, and how schools are going to be using these new platforms more effectively. So, and again, the essence of science and technology is creativity. So, and the other thing I want to say about that is part of STEM is understanding the nature of our scientific and technological society. And especially as we're entering this realm of AI, where there's been a lot of negative discussion around the negative impacts of AI on society as a whole. And this is something I said to students the other day. I said, you're the voters of the future. Some of you are only 2 or 3 years away from voting, some less. You should be informed about these technologies. You should be able to make an informed decision about policy and practice and laws regarding these technologies. So there is going to be regulation of AI. There's no question about that. What kind of regulation is the question? Who gets to decide on the type of regulation? That we need an informed citizenship to be able to inform their elected officials about these type of their opinion on it, but also in the direction these things should go. Unfortunately, there are not many well-versed politicians who are well-versed in AI. I hope they have good staff who are going to do the research required. But in the bottom line is, citizens vote for their representatives, and they need to do that in an informed way. And so, so I would still continue to advocate around STEM is even more important in the future, not to become someone who's going to pursue a STEM career, but just to be able to speak and act intelligently about STEM in our society.
Do you think there's enough of that going on now? Consideration of the effect of all of these technologies on society?
Depends where you live. I mean, let's use climate change as an example. In some places, you're not even allowed to talk about climate change, right? In others, if you're following the next generation science standards, then you certainly should be talking about climate. The impact of human activity on climate, all right? And so that's part of the next generation science standards. It's part of the Massachusetts science standards, right? What's the impact of society on climate and natural systems?
What did Pontius Pilate say? What is truth? Where does
what is truth?
Yeah, what is truth? Where does AI come into that whole problem of what's real, what's true?
Yeah, so it's interesting you quote that, because that says that basically this is not a modern day problem. Although maybe it's more prevalent, but the fact is it's a millennial problem. It's been for 2,000 years, right? The question
is 5,000. It's actually more like 5,000 or 6,000.
Yeah, if we go back into the Greeks, right? And
back to Mount Sinai. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the bottom line is that I think that's, and the idea that you can stop someone from finding out information about a subject is laughable. Just having the internet, we know, and kids, everyone has phones, if they don't have a phone, they have a computer, and even trying to limit it, is very, very challenging, because there are some communities that try to limit the use of those technologies. But in the end, you walk out the door and a student is able to find out anything they want to find out about anything imaginable. So I think, again, it goes back to what we need to be teaching students about critical thinking, analysis, citations. So if they use ChatGPT, we shouldn't want them to hide the fact that they use it. They cite it as a source. I remember when Wikipedia came out, and still some people will hold to this today, but people would say, like, You cannot use Wikipedia as a source. Do not cite Wikipedia as a source for your paper. Now it's probably one of the first sources that pops up if you do a search on a topic,
It is.
And it's a trusted source, now. Now, we don't
Yeah.
say just use Wikipedia. We say use a variety of sources. So I think that's the same. We're going to have to approach this in the future. So the idea that you can impose one way of thinking, I think, is going to be very challenging.
I can think of a whole lot of people that are going to argue with you about that. Yes, we can impose our way of thinking. That's what we've always done.
You can, and it's not only political, but it's also faith-based. You have Orthodox communities, and not just in the Jewish faith, but in other faiths as well. There are Orthodox Christians, there are Orthodox Muslims,
Orthodox everything. Yeah.
Right, and so if they want to impose their way of thinking on their children, or if they want to teach their way of thinking, they are entitled to. But the world is very broad out there now.
You used the phrase a while ago, collaborate with AI. Not use AI, collaborate with AI. What do you mean by that? What is the distinction between use AI and collaborate with AI?
Yeah, so I can use ChatGPT to generate an essay on any topic imaginable, or I can collaborate with it. Sal Khan did a great demonstration last week at TED Talk where he had the AI write a line of an essay, and then the student generate the line, and then AI write another line, and then the student generate another line. That's a really good example of a writing collaboration. Microsoft has the GitHub Copilot. So notice the name Copilot. It's a coding. It's using actually ChatGPT. It's what powers Microsoft GitHub Copilot, and you can code with it. All right, so you collaborate with generating the code. And that's what I hear, many coders who are embracing AI right now are doing. They're using it for preliminary generation of code, and then they're running through the code themselves and making corrections, making changes. And I don't know if you know Lex Friedman from MIT, but he said, he's improved his coding speed, anywhere from 5 to 10 to 20 times. And he just expects it to get faster. So
let's just pause on that for a minute. That's a statement that has huge implications. Coding, I mean, you can increase your coding speed 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. So where's that
so the
taking
jobs
us?
implications, the implication of job opportunities, coding. We've been trying to get all these students to pursue coding as a career. Now what? Many of them are anywhere from 4 to 6 years away from a job, still in their education.
So is it necessary to be teaching? Well, that's what you're saying. Is it necessary to be teaching coding at all?
Not in the way we've taught it in the past.
But it is necessary. Although it is necessary, a human has to know something about coding in order to tell whether AI is giving you something valid or something invalid, right? Like you need to know if ChatGPT tells you something like George Washington's Continental Army was destroyed in Brooklyn in 1778. The British just wiped them out. If you don't know otherwise, how are you supposed to know whether that's true or not?
Yeah, so you do have to know something about it. But in that example of the robot I gave you, we also did a couple of other things, and it was generating. We had some errors when we went to upload it into the Arduino compiler that we were using, and we were having trouble with the code. And we went back to ChatGPT and said, "This code's not working. We're getting this error. Please, investigate further." And then it came back with, "Oh yeah, you're right. There is that error in here. Here's how you can fix it." I mean, I was watching an episode of Picard, Star Trek, last week, and in it, they wanted to compare the genetic code of people who've been through the transporter before and after a certain date, because they started to suspect that something was happening in the transporter. And so they said, computer, compare the code of this person from this date with this person from that date. And, within seconds, they had a response. And I sat back and said, you know what? We are going to be able to do that if we can't already do it. And we are going to be able to talk to the computer just like that and say, computer, compare this to that. So compare this code to that code. I don't care what it's for, but it could be comparison of code or comparison of a sentence or we're living science fiction right now.
Okay, but then that makes us totally dependent on the the AI. If we don't know the difference ourselves, and it tells us no, it's not this, it's that, how the hell do we know, or how do we even have the capacity to tell whether it's telling us the truth?
Well, it's kind of like, I have a friend who's an AI engineer, and he's designing a model that can examine X-rays for this defect in the eye. It's X-rays of the human eye, and there's this defect that's almost imperceivable in an X-ray. And a human has to look at it very, very carefully. And he's developing a model that will be able to look at thousands of X-rays in minutes, and then give the human the ones that are most likely to be a problem. And again, shows how the human working with the AI. So instead of, from eye fatigue and time fatigue and everything else of looking at X-rays for any extended period of time, the computer will do that. And then the human will get the output and say, okay, these 10 X-rays are the most likely to exhibit this defect. Then they can look into that further. I think that's what so yes, you still have to know something. You still have to, I think there's still a foundational knowledge. It's not like everything in the future is about process. There is still foundational knowledge. But the fact is, we're going to be able to walk around with basically supercomputing artificial intelligence in our pocket. We are going to be walking around with that.
Mike, this has been a great conversation. And as usual, you've given me a headache just trying to keep up with you. I appreciate your time and your expertise, and I look forward to our next conversation. But thanks very much.
All right, Gary, you're very welcome. Really enjoyed our talk together, and definitely we have a lot more to talk about as these developments are coming at us day by day. So look forward to the next time. Thanks again.
We would like to thank Michael Mino for joining us for this month's JFY Networks podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please navigate to our website, jfynet.org, which features a wealth of commentary, dialogue, and free educational resources, including these monthly podcasts, to support all educational communities. Thank you for joining us. For JFY Networks, I'm Greg Cunningham.